All right, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Awesome, good to be here today. So as mentioned, Andrew Bloom, VP of Sales at Vector Zero, and I'm excited to be here today in the one and only Eugene, Oregon. They gave us beautiful weather today. I was expecting rain, but no, it's sunny and nice. And I'm here to keep your skies sunny and talk about addressing residual risk beyond NIST 800-53-5 while highlighting a few emergent approaches such as automated moving target defense, confidential computing, and post-quantum encryption. And I'm especially excited to be here today. As mentioned, UO alum, loud and proud Oregon Duck. And I can confidently say this is the one and only time my student fan of the game picture ever ended up in a professional presentation. So definitely am a loud and proud Duck, especially in Autzen on Saturdays. But yeah, moving on from the fun stuff to the really fun stuff. Our company, Vector Zero, we're a Virginia-based cybersecurity and data governance company. Most of our team are former U.S. intelligence community officers. So a lot of our focus to date has been on national security. So I'm here today to speak about those national security use cases, but this is the cyber physical track. So I'll also be talking about the work that we're doing with Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI for short, which is a trade association of utility members that represents about 90% of the power generation here in the US. And so I'll circle back to that as the talk progresses. Just a quick show of hands, how many people here are like utilities or OT data people? Awesome, so we'll be speaking your language and sharing some use cases from what we're doing with EPRI. And just for other folks in the room, a quick background on what NIST 853 Rev 5 is and why we're talking about exceeding it. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has several frameworks, with their most comprehensive, most secure framework being 853 Rev 5, which they use as a catalog of security and privacy controls for information systems to protect organizational assets, individuals, and the nation, from a real diverse set of threats and risks, including hostile attacks and human errors, natural disasters, foreign intelligence agencies, privacy risks, all the things that we've been hearing and talking about all day today. So this 853.5 framework is a great starting place for your organization's security posture, but it's kind of also a roadmap for your adversaries because this framework is public information, right? So the adversaries, they can see that framework, which kind of makes them think, well, how can we think creatively outside of the box of the controls mentioned here to attack you in creative ways? So we'll be talking about actually exceeding NIST. And some of the ways that those adversaries are going to think about attacking you are here on the right side of the screen, right, my right, I think it's your left, like advanced persistent threats and others. So you guys are probably familiar with these, but I'm going to highlight a few of them and how we're going to protect against those. But at the same time, security professionals, we need to offer a certain threshold of performance and usability for our business stakeholders, right? So we're going to talk about how to consider these security approaches and mitigating these threats in the context that jives with your relevant business requirements. But the three emergent cybersecurity techniques beyond NIST that we're going to focus on and highlight are automated moving target defense, confidential computing, and post-quantum encryption. So the first threat I really want to deep dive into is advanced persistent threats, because according to IBM's Cost of a Data Breach report, the average time to identify and contain a breach in critical infrastructure industries in 2022 was 273 days. So those 273 days, that counter starts at number 7 on the graphic here on, I'm just going to go with my side, it's my left, I think it's your right. Initial intrusion there, right? So once adversaries are in, you know this, they're moving laterally, they're expanding their access, they're strengthening their foothold, ultimately to exfiltrate or tamper with your data. So those 273 days, like that's 9 months. That's a long time to have the bad guys in your network, and statistics like this kind of imply that incumbent methods of threat detection and response really aren't keeping up. So what if we can turn that model on its head though? And what if we never had to detect the adversary to respond? What if rather than our current security model of detect and react, we are just proactively responding without ever even knowing if the adversary has penetrated our defenses? That's partly what automated moving target defense is all about. Moving target defense is a way to dynamically change the attack surface of your infrastructure, and it's all now possible because of software, ephemeral software-defined infrastructure. Which basically the way it works is you push a button to stand up a brand new infrastructure in the cloud. It's an automated orchestration of everything you need to run your workload, like servers, networking, storage, firewalls, encryption keys, etc. All the security controls of NIST 853 Rev 5. Just imagine if you can do that at a push of a button. Why not push that same button again to stand up a concurrent infrastructure and then continually move the compartment of data and users on a regular basis? It doesn't mean you need to abandon intrusion detection, because if you keep regularly scanning, you now have triggered infrastructure moves as an additional incident response maneuver. By the way, before this talk, some of us were joking around about Venus flytraps and stuff, and I promised I'd try and make a joke on the fly about that. But the joke being, like, if you touch that Venus flytrap, it's going to react, right? But the lady in the red here, I'm sorry, I didn't catch her name. She was saying, if you put a dead fly in there, it won't necessarily react, right? But actually, that dead fly is probably still food for that Venus flytrap, right? So if we think about that in the same way as the adversaries, it's like if that Venus flytrap would respond to a dead fly in there, they'd still get the same protein and meal. So I don't know if that worked on the fly. I was trying to think of how to bring that up. I figured it was worth a try. But getting back to kind of the organized talk here, in practice, moving target defense probably sounds like a lot of work, like standing up all this and reconfiguring everything. And we see a lot of components of an architecture here. So while it's generally true that standing all this up would be a lot of work, we have actually automated the process to be just a few clicks by a non-technical user. Every time you press Restart Vault, your data and users and policies and settings are kept, but everything else is destroyed, which destroys any possible implanted malicious code and stands you back up elsewhere in the cloud with new ports, new IP addresses, and other components that malicious actors would need for a successful attack. Essentially, you push them back to square one. So kind of like when Dan Lanning and the rest of the coaches change the signals every week in Autzen. They do that because if the coaches were watching last week's game and intercepted some of those signals, that intelligence is now useless this week because all those signals have changed. Here's another way to visualize the workflow I was just talking about. Come into your office in the morning, and while you make your coffee, press a button to automatically stand up your vault. Then run your workload. At 5 o'clock, when it's time to go home, save your compartment and tear down the whole vault. So we've destroyed any possible implanted code, we've reduced your attack surface to near zero while your data is isolated in cold storage, and actually we saved you a lot of money because you're not paying your cloud service provider for all the infrastructure we saw on the previous slide when you're not using it. And then the next morning, you come back into the office while you're making your coffee, you push that Restart Vault button and get back to work right where you left off with a brand new, fully patched and updated infrastructure, which is going to make your jobs as sysadmins easier because it's now all your firewalls, everything's back up to the latest version from Cisco and Palo Alto and all the other great vendors that we're standing on. And by the way, if you have multiple concurrent vaults at the same time, how does that affect zero trust implementation? Well, neither your users nor malicious actors can move laterally from one vault to another, making this an easy, scalable zero trust solution that implements incrementally when each team is ready, rather than a whole enterprise transformation all at once, which can be particularly impactful for critical infrastructure where, despite the Biden administration mandate that all critical infrastructure organizations adopt zero trust by 2024, only 1 in 5 have actually done so. It can also be very practical for cloud migration use cases, right? Push a button, stand it up, you now have a very secure infrastructure in the cloud to host your workload and data. Next, I'm going to talk about how moving target defense sets us up for a future resilient to quantum computers like this one in China, which is one of the biggest quantum computers in the world. A quantum computer like this one can significantly outperform classical computers on calculations like factorization speed, which is relevant to cryptography. In doing so, quantum computers can theoretically decrypt hundreds of millions of times faster than the best supercomputers we have today, which has led to a rise in SNDL or HNDL attacks, which stands for store now, decrypt later, or harvest now, decrypt later. These attacks are where adversaries intercept encrypted sensitive communications, storing them for a later date when a quantum computer like this one is built and available to decrypt those ciphers into plain text. By the way, as someone who works with a lot of people in national security, I would love to take a baseball bat to this thing. I just think it'd be a lot of fun. So again, what does automated moving target defense have to do with post-quantum? If you can rapidly reconfigure your infrastructure, why not change encryption algorithms as needed? Because each of these encryption algorithms have post-quantum potential. But every business case is unique, and until quantum computers become more mainstream, it's really unknown which one is best. Like, I like Kyber, I like Bike, elliptic curve's a little bit more emergent, right? So if we can be easily post-quantum compatible in the future, the way to do that is to rapidly and easily interchange with the best and the latest in post-quantum encryption algorithms, right? Because let's say DARPA comes out with a new one tomorrow. They're working on a really cool one called genetic encryption, actually. If we're built on a software-defined infrastructure, we can easily reconfigure to that new encryption algorithm if that's what we need to do. So let's talk about AI, right? Everyone, including your organization, is starting to talk about AI. I don't know what happened there. Lost my slides. We're back. That's peculiar. Huh. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Let's see. I don't know why it just booted me. Let's go to settings. It's weird that it did it mid-presentation, right? You know? Try display settings, huh? See if that works. Let's see. Any thoughts? Should I just unplug it and plug it back in? That's the general.
It's extending now.
Oh, yeah.
Start over.
Oh, there you go.
F5.
Thanks a bunch.
I got you, dude. Yeah, function F5. Right up. Yeah, that's close enough.
Yeah. Sorry about that, guys. I must have pressed something. It's that automated moving target defense. So where were we? We were about to start talking about AI, which brings me to my third topic, which is confidential computing. Because the problem with incumbent encryption is that it only protects data in two states. I'll give you guys a minute. You probably have heard, you know, you're walking around all these conferences, you're talking to vendors, they're talking about two states of data, usually. They're talking about at rest and in transit. I didn't realize before I did this pop quiz, it's on the screen behind me. Because I'm about to talk about data in use, which is like when we're running analytics, AI, or machine learning. How does the code perform its function if the data is never in plain text? And believe it or not, with confidential computing, it's now possible to keep your data in ciphertext 24/7 and still use your data, still run compute on it. The way it works is by using software to quarantine cores on the hardware, on the chip itself. This creates an isolated, trusted execution environment, and then we control ingress or egress of data from there with the encryption key. Now your data is secure in process and memory, even when running AI and ML. And before I go on, we talked earlier about meeting the performance needs of your clients and your business cases, right? So no, this won't slow you down, not in any human perceivable way at least, right? Because confidential computing runs with less than 1% performance overhead. So if you can have your data encrypted at all times and without compromising speed or usability, why not make always encrypted data the default setting? Speaking of humans, what does confidential computing mean for insider threat vectors? It means we can make data accessible to code while keeping it unreadable to people. In other words, your data engineers can load and join disparate data sets, your data scientists can run computations, and your platform administrator can grant access to do so, all with none of those employees ever being able to see the PAI, PHI, or other sensitive data. A truism our CTO Sean Grimaldi always says, And by the way, he was at CIA for over a decade, and before that was a principal developer of SQL Server while he was at Microsoft. But the truism he always says is the best way to counter insider threat is to have it never exist at all, meaning the less people who see the data, the less inherent risk that one of those people will be compromised. Whoops, jumped ahead too far, sorry about that. So now extrapolate that same fact to your cloud service provider like Google or Amazon or Microsoft. Like, how many people work at those cloud service providers? Like hundreds of thousands, right? So that's a pretty big threat vector, and there's sufficient evidence that, people who work there who have physical or root access to those machines, they have the ability to compromise them. One is Paige Thompson. If you look up Paige Thompson, that person worked at Amazon and compromised JP Morgan's sensitive data and went to jail for 6 years. So certainly that does happen, and especially in use cases with highly sensitive data where it's valuable to do so. But let's take that idea one step further, though, for third-party vendors or other outside organizations that you don't necessarily want to trust. Imagine you have 3 banks who have a mutual interest in AI for fraud detection. Ideally, the best way to train that AI for fraud detection would be if you provide the model with as much training data as possible across multiple data sets from all 3 banks. At the same time, these 3 banks, they don't trust each other. They don't want to share their sensitive data with one another. So what if they didn't have to? With secure multi-party computation, which is made possible by confidential computing, they can encrypt their data so no other bank can see it. The other banks do the same, and they can jointly run code on the aggregate data across all 3 data sets. In this manner, they're keeping their inputs private while performing a joint computation. Here's a real-world example that we're working towards for EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, and their member utilities who have a huge data governance challenge. The challenge is anytime a utility wants to work with a new vendor, like a startup or even old vendors that they've worked with for decades, they spend hours filling out forms, working with cyber, digital, supply chain, regulatory, legal, etc., in a multi-business unit process to assess risk that ultimately slows down innovation and takes time away from high-impact work. For example, usually someone in some department will end up saying no because that's just less risk for that one individual and for their team, and it's less work for them personally. So, that means less innovative pilots and more sandbox dummy data, which makes pilots less informative and particularly around scaling decisions. Let's go to the next slide here. Whoops, sorry about that. I don't know where my mouse is. There we go. So we propose secure multi-party computation to reduce risk for everyone involved. If the vendor never sees the data, right, that's why we have the locks on it, and the data never leaves the secure enclave, but the computation still happens, the utility gets the results they need without the added risk of data leakage or exposure. And by the way, the startup also now is keeping their valuable IP encrypted at all times and never exposing that, which is pretty much their entire valuation right there. And the same approach can be applied not just to AI/ML, but also to computational queries, such as this analytic scenario that I have here. In this simple example, a data scientist is not allowed to see the 3 data sets, but they are authorized to query those data sets for a user that exists in at least 2 out of 3 data sets. The code runs the query on the data, and the data scientist only sees the results without ever seeing the other data sets writ large. Which brings me to one last concept I want to talk about, which is attestation. If we can use confidential computing to technically enforce what queries are ran, why not use cryptography to technically enforce other aspects of the workload? For example, if you want to run version 1.37 of a specific firmware, how would you verify that you have that exact version and not a compromised or tampered with version? The firmware could have thousands of lines of code, and so that's pretty difficult to verify, right? So what we do with attestation is we take cryptographic measurements of trusted software and we import those measurements into a machine-readable policy, and then use AI/ML to adjudicate against that corporate policy. So if it turns out the measurements of your firmware match the trusted version, and the measurements of your software and operating system also match expectations, then the adjudication will be successful and will release computing or connection or data or the key. But if an adversary has tampered with your supply chain, say having implanted some malicious code into the 25 million lines of code that make up your operating system, the measurements won't match, and the release will not occur. So, what is the impact of that? The impact of attestation from a security perspective is a technical and automated means to verify more and trust less when it comes to your vendors and partner and supply chain security, which is particularly relevant to operational technology, the OT data that a lot of people in this room are pretty focused on. Because as you guys know, OT data is basically data that controls physical devices, right? So oftentimes what's important for OT data, it's not necessarily confidentiality. It's the integrity of the data, right? Like what I mean by that is adversaries aren't interested in stealing the data, but they're more interested in changing or tampering with that data. For example, with the power grid, stealing phaser data is like pointless. It's not PII or particularly sensitive. But changing phaser data could cause massive reverberating problems throughout the power grid, right? Because now you're going to change the measurements of your generation and your transmission and your distribution, et cetera, which could really cause problems. Another example, like Stuxnet, right? Like where Siemens firmware was compromised to change the speed of the centrifuges and then compromised an entire uranium enrichment facility. But with attestation, we can ensure that the firmware is tamper resistant and thus prevent those scenarios. So to recap, NIST 853.5 has security, has thousands of controls, and is like a really great starting place. So we stand up our active data vault product with those controls as a baseline. From there, we use automated moving target defense to outrun adversaries and prevent them from ever gaining a foothold. We also encrypt data with the best in post-quantum today and maintain crypto agility to continue evolving to tomorrow's best-in-class post-quantum capabilities and solutions. Lastly, we encrypt data at all times, including in use, which both secures data and opens up a whole new world of collaboration by keeping data private while jointly running computations and by enabling attestation for verifying identity and integrity. And with all these features together, EPRI has been testing our active data vault in their Knoxville Cyber Lab across a number of use cases that I describe here, like secure isolated backups for configuration files or other data, basically a secure bunker isolated from the rest of their perimeter as a backup to archive their data, cloud migration to a NERC-CIP ready infrastructure, which by the way, NERC-CIP's just like another framework similar to NIST, but for utilities. And basically what EPRI has been doing has been testing common utility applications in our enclave and all the while testing for NERC-CIP conformance. And we were able to run several common utility applications while meeting those NERC-CIP levels that they needed to meet all in the cloud. They've also been testing us for the secure multi-party computation use case I highlighted earlier and for secure AI ML. And lastly, they've been working on how ADV can assist utilities with zero trust implementation. So I think that's all I have for now, but I think we've got some time, right? So Q&A? Also, go Ducks. How many people in the room are Ducks? There we go. There we go. That's my people. Awesome. We got a question. I was going to say if there's no questions, we can talk football, but I want to hear the question.
So going back to immutable infrastructure. So when you start to break down the process of building an infrastructure in this fashion, tools like Ansible and things like that get you the technical step-by-step from implementing something like that. What are the risks associated with having infrastructure like this where you segregate data from services and infrastructure from processes where that process can break down and then you've knocked yourself offline with what you've tried to create to prevent that from happening? What are some of the risks? What are some of the things that are built into the infrastructure that prevent things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question because I talked a lot about, there's the CIA model, right, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I talked a lot about confidentiality and integrity, right, keeping your data private and preventing people from tampering with it. But if I understood the question, one part of it was, what about availability? How do you ensure that you're up and running at all times and consistently available for your users. So one way we think about that, I mean, of course, being cloud native, we're distributed among the Amazon data centers. So we're in Southern Oregon at the same time as we're in Northern Virginia. So if one has an adverse event, we are bidirectional in both. So we can exist in Southern Oregon and in Northern Virginia to make sure that we're live and ready as needed for you, and rely on kind of like the scalability of the cloud for that. Additionally, I think to answer your question about risks, I almost see it as less inherent risk because, sometimes people say, well, who are your competitors? And we think about that not as much in terms of like even though we're a SaaS product, we don't think about like other products as our competitor. In a way, we think about labor as our main competitor, right? Because if you want to stand up a secure enclave to, for a specific team, that could take you a long time. There's a lot of risks in, maybe misconfiguring it, or maybe they build it really well, but then that guy or girl, maybe that woman goes on maternity leave who built that for you, or that guy goes to another job, right? And in that case, who's maintaining that infrastructure for you? And what's, I think, helps de-risk it is that we maintain the infrastructure. So if you have turnover within your team, we continue to keep that infrastructure available for you and working well. So those are a few ways that I think about availability and ways that we mitigate those risks. But it's a good question because I didn't talk about the A in the CIA model. So I guess if there's no other questions, I'd like to ask a question, in terms of like utility pain points and what I've spoken to, what folks who raised their hand earlier and said, hey, I work at a utility. What are some of the pain points that you've encountered similar to this, and how, can we riff on those for a little bit? Anybody want to talk about challenges or?
What's the challenge of standing up such an infrastructure from zero? Talk about the process.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to this slide here of everything that you need to set up, right? It's multiple layers for an entire infrastructure, right? You need to stand up servers, networking, storage, compute, firewalls. You need to make sure that that's all working and integrated. What else do we have here? Access controls and management, your threat detection. So we're standing all of that up basically at the push of a button. And in that way, it's all very tightly configured. That it comes in a way that's maintained and in a way that's ephemeral, right? So if you want to tear that down, you can easily do that. And I think, I mentioned we work a lot with the intelligence community. The way that they used to do this was to hire like a Booz Allen Hamilton or Leidos or KBR, these big prime integrators to stand these up. And the typical amount of time to do so was about 12 to 18 months. The typical cost was about $2 to $3 million with another $1 million a year to maintain. In contrast to that, we stand up in minutes, and we're a SaaS product that is a huge fraction of that price, like a lot less. So I think it's really about that, but it's also about your own time and energy with your team, right? Because if you're focused on standing up this whole cloud infrastructure, then you're less focused on that the last mile, right? Which is integrating with your own data repository, with your own specific users and use cases. And that's really what we want you focused on is in your organization. If we can come to you and deliver an enclave that's ready to go, and then we spend, our time with you just configuring that last mile to make sure that your users are actually using it. I was talking with someone earlier who was like, yeah, we stand some of these up sometimes and we spend months doing that. And then we log in and they never use it. And it's like, well, what was the risk there? Well, the risk was it didn't get managed in an implementation where it worked out. And so what we would do is make sure that we're working with you to focus on that aspect, because this legwork is already done in an automated way. It's a great question. Yeah?
I can't speak for any other utilities, but I know that some places have a
Yeah.
Some of our problems are not technical, they are measuring.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why when we started working with Electric Power Research Institute, the idea was, okay, demonstrate this in the Knoxville Cyber Lab so that utilities can just see this running in action with their software and see what the lift will look like, which is negligible, right? And that way, instead of trying to validate for themselves and run their own tests and spin up their own people, they can just observe what EPRI's done. So EPRI's making a video, they're authoring a white paper, they're doing all this work, and they're paying us to do this. We're not paying them, they're paying us, right? It's a paid demonstration pilot. So, their cybersecurity subject matter experts have been kicking the tires like hard on this product so that they can validate that it's going to work with common utility applications and data sets, configuration files, meter data. We used Schweitzer, GE products, RTAC, Quickset, like all these different files that they're using. So ideally, we're showing them like it's de-risked in that sense. I think the other thing is to really start with that use case. And that's kind of why I put up the data governance use case, right? We're working some of the utilities, two of the utilities that we're deep in talks with are among the 15 largest utility companies in the country, right? They multi-billion-dollar balance sheet utilities that have the exact problem that you just talked about where, organizational inertia and process, right? So we started with their R&D teams, with their innovation teams. And the reason being is because those guys are trying to implement innovative products across the enterprise, right? I'm talking about maybe it's a new, like I saw one that was an AI for on their power lines, right? To make sure that their power lines like don't catch fire and that they're efficiently moving around electricity, right? And so it's like, well, they want that AI company needs the data to train the algorithm to then make that grid more efficient, right? But the company can't get the data because they can't get the utility to release the data. So that's why we said, well, we can start by solving that problem, right? So in that case, wasn't even a security challenge. It was a data governance challenge. So we have to start with what is the problem, right? And I think the problem could be NERC SIP cloud migration. It could be, isolated storage of your backup files. It could be the data governance. And once we kind of have, okay, here's the pain point, then we take the environment and make sure that it's going to solve that problem. And that's how we'll overcome the kind of inertia of like, well, let's find what is broken and work together to solve it from there. Is that my time? All right. Well, I'll hang around here for a little bit after. And sorry again for the technical difficulties. And thanks, everyone. Go Ducks.